Okay, we're going to start. In case you've forgotten, Justin Carmel is from FIU, Florida International University, Department of Chemistry, and take it away.
Thanks. All right, thank you. So this morning, what we're going to be talking about is a little bit different. So my research at FIU focuses on students' identity and lots of things. Mostly their identity as a chemistry person or a science person. And so I've been studying this a lot over the past 2 years in my tenure track career. And so I want to share a bit of the thinking that I do on a daily basis with you today, because I actually think it'll be really helpful in informing what we do with our action plans. And so I heard a few questions about where FIU was yesterday. So this is our library on campus. It's in the land of warm weather, Miami, Florida. This is my favorite view of our campus. So that's the tallest building on our campus. That's the Green Library. On the 8th floor, there are a bunch of conference rooms, which you can rent out for conferences and meetings. The bad part about them is you can see all the way to the beach. And so you're 16 miles from the beach, but you can see all the way there even though you're at work. So what I ask, and for this to be successful today, is that you kind of play along. I'm going to ask you to do some things that are a little bit hokey, but I would just ask that you play along. So we're going to jump into our first activity. You all should have a sheet on your table that says worksheet number or workshop number 3, the heading at the top, and we're going to start on the side that has the first prompt that says draw your ideal TA. Okay? And so you're going to do this. I want you to do it individually, and I want you to be able to be ready to elaborate on as many things about your drawing as possible. Okay? And so for example, if you drew your TA wearing safety glasses, I would hope that you would explain because safety is important in the laboratory. Note that you cannot use this one now that I've given it to you. Okay? But what I want you to do is while you're drawing your TA, focus on the transformation that you'd like to accomplish. We spent a lot of time yesterday focusing on goals and ways to assess it, and so I want you to keep that transformation or that pedagogical change in mind as you draw your ideal TA. So take about 7 minutes to draw your TAs. They do not have to be beautiful. I expect a lot of stick figures. Probably. And so you still have plenty of time. There's still like 3.5 minutes left to draw. But if you already have the person, the ideal TA, also put in, what environment are they in? What are they doing in the classroom? Like I said, 7 minutes was intentional.
Oh, yeah, I parked with the police just the area. Thanks so much.
Okay, your 7 minutes is up. You can stop drawing. I know, we're scientists in this room, not artists. But, so again, individually, the next thing I would like you to do is looking at your ideal TA, or your drawing, or just in your mind, your vision of the ideal TA. Take another 3 to 5 minutes, again, individually, to list adjectives that would describe this ideal TA. Okay? So listing those adjectives that describe your ideal TA. And I'd like this to be done individually. All right, it looks like most people are done writing adjectives. Okay, so the reason I've asked you to do this is because I wanted you to get an accurate picture of what you hope that ideal TA looks like and acts like in class. Now, time for some reflection. The next thing I want you to do is, head TAs, I want you to just think about and kind of reflect on how close you feel to this ideal TA. What do you need to improve on personally? How could you be more like this ideal TA? And professors, I would like you to look at and think about how close is your average TA to this ideal TA. Okay? So think about where your average TAs are, or TAs, think about where you are, and think about how close or far you are from this ideal. Again, take like 3 minutes to reflect on this individually.
Write it down?
Yes, you can write it down. Okay, so I notice more people are engaging in discussion, so that must mean you're done, right? So thank you for playing along with this. There is a purpose to this, but this actual activity is something I use in my research to understand how students view themselves as scientists or non-scientists. We have actually done this with a number of students, especially at college. This harkens back to kind of classical research done on views of science, especially with small children. They would ask them to draw what a scientist looks like and ask them why they drew particular things. And so I wanted to do this with you today because I think it will bring up some really good ideas about what you want out of a TA and what your TA should be doing in the classroom. So now you get to collaborate. What I would like you to do is, in your teams, discuss the similarities and differences you might have in your drawings, as well as the list of adjectives you have. So take this time in your teams to discuss these similarities and differences. Take about 10 minutes to do this. This should be pretty substantive.
This is going to be fun.
There's a method to my madness. It's all up here. What do you think?
We use a funny, like a similar but different strategy that we came up with out of Brian's America's research because he's studying success. So we started using that theme structure that's like, this person thinks I do, this person thinks I do, to have people pick pictures
That's
of
really...
people who think success as different experiences in their lives. Similar to the history of
Ears to listen, big heart. Somebody who remembers what it's like to be an undergrad, and a little bit of that, like you were saying, compassionate, like understanding. Right. My notes on the board, those first times in class, yeah, or erase them. So yeah, you're right.
I think a majority of this I try based on my own teaching. Because
it's a really good excited about it.
But he's also
Okay, that's kind of, I mean, if that's something that you want to continue.
all right, let me
Your TAs look much better than anything I've ever drawn.
they're great.
This looks more my speed.
Yeah, that's
thank you. This is a student.
That's great.
Yeah.
So how close is your average TA to your ideal TA?
I feel like we have bimodal.
yeah.
Right now.
Isn't that always the case?
Yeah.
Right.
So I would say the high end is pretty close, and if I take the quartiles, if you will, then the low end is pretty far.
Okay.
Which
Okay.
how about what do you? What do you
Yeah, no, totally that. Yeah. Especially this last semester.
All right, good. What are some of your adjectives?
Smiling, welcoming, listening, non-judgmental.
Good. None of those are about physics.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah.
Have you used this activity for TAs to do
Not yet.
they're already a student?
Not yet. Something that I might talk to some of our FIU groups about doing. But I've just strictly used this for research. When I do this with research participants, we actually give them 2 boxes of colored pencils, one that's all the different skin tones, and then one that's just a regular box of 12 colored pencils. So I have a current undergrad who's doing this with black students who identify as black, and they all reach for the black colored pencil, which is wonderful. But it's currently we have 4 women participants, and 3 of them drew women. They drew themselves, and one of them drew the interviewer, who is a male, and said, actually, it looks just like you, kind of nerdy, glasses, tall, curly hair, and the interviewer's just like, okay, thank you.
Have you ever had, because I know for me, it's hard for me to draw and put things in a drawing. You ever have people act stuff out?
I haven't had them act, but If they are reticent to draw or they don't feel comfortable drawing, I ask them to do listing the adjectives, or if you were to describe this person, what do they look like, and they'll describe.
He's gonna have to. Why should we do all the training?
But I mean, I'm the same way. If we get white instead of red, I think.
All right, let me see what you do.
What are we polling?
Polling for beer and wine.
Oh,
So that's the thing. Yes.
To list every single lab and share with others, or
not quite yet, but stay in your teams for now.
There's a marker in a clock. So did you draw this one, or did you just?
So what were some of your big similarities and differences?
so we realized that we all drew the same.
Well, that's good. That means that you're all on the same page.
We were like thinking about labs.
We all put words.
We all, yeah, we had TA.
We had physics.
talking about physics to students. And then I didn't want to facilitating yourself just that's lecturing. Yeah,
Good.
yeah. Trying to have, the TA engaging directly with the
So the question becomes, how close is your average TA to that ideal TA?
Yeah, so I think well,
Yeah, mine's pretty
I don't
much
know, I
the
won't
same.
speak for everyone. For me,
all of the
I said
other
there was a really big range, so maybe
Okay.
the mean TA is like...
That's why I said the average. I know we can't take averages of people, but average TA, yeah.
There are some who are really close to the ideal TA and some who are really far.
Okay.
So our mean TA is, halfway there.
Good. All right, take about another minute and wrap up your discussion. Another minute.
But your idea.
Sorry?
No worries.
Might have white wine.
Okay, so now that your teams have discussed the similarities and differences, I hope this was eye-opening, or maybe you found out that you weren't necessarily on the same page with what an ideal TA should be from the TA perspective and the professor perspective. But what I would like you to do now together as a team is to actually make a list of expectations you have of your ideal TA. Now, this can be a combination of the things that you both drew or both described, but what I want you to do is make a list of expectations that you would have for your ideal TA in your classroom. And again, keeping in mind this pedagogical or this transformation that you came here to facilitate. Take 5 minutes. Go.
She's being all symbolic with the big boots, staying grounded.
I thought that was because it was winter.
That is accomplishing a whole lot.
Slowing things out.
How are you this morning? Me too.
Yeah.
But at least you don't have to facilitate today. You can just, yeah. But you don't have to present.
That's true.
Still be able to
Which work? Even I'm busy. Physics class.
Because these are things you don't really need.
It was my job. So.
Oh yeah. But I think my question.
Yeah, there we go.
But you, I guess, yeah, you should like, but you shouldn't like work extra hard.
I don't think I've ever had anybody like it's always
Responsive, there are lots of work. I didn't have known if
the first class, this is 3-hour-long class. Hour-long class. Tuesday 4:30 to 7:30.
Okay, so now that you have a list of expectations that you have, your team has of your ideal TA, this is where kind of the rubber meets the road, is your next task, right? So when or how does a TA learn to do the things that you've said an ideal TA should do? And if you know that they do them, or if you think that they learn when they learn them, what evidence do you have to support this notion when they learn it? So this is where we start getting into this action plan planning, right? And so it's not necessarily working on your action plan, but this is almost the most important part. All of the drawing is fun, but this is where the rubber meets the road, right? So when or how does a TA learn to do these things that you expect of them, and what evidence do you have to support your thoughts? Yes?
Currently or in our ideal plan when we return?
So when or how does your TAs currently learn how to do the things your ideal TA should do? Go forth.
You're right, I don't know anything about it.
This contraption has changed where the cold air is flowing.
I know. It's just pointing, well, and I've got flip-flops on, so it's just pointing it all down at my toes. And it's like, every time I walk by this, I just like curl my toes under.
Yeah. All the time. What? At a sub-level,
I appreciate that your TA has safety goggles on.
Listen, bitch, you can't tell me not to go to safety goggles. Bite. Find me a burrito.
You're one of very few. Well, there's food over there now.
Oh, did the food come
The food has arrived, but you're one of very few chemistry teams that drew goggles. Less important.
That's like 5.
We basically send out everybody on
Alright.
Was she my wine person?
No, Claudia was a red wine. She was actually.
No, but the way they have it Jenny and
All right. I know I keep stopping you and giving you new tasks, but this is me trying to move the discussion along. So now that you have this, when or how do they learn it, the last question becomes, and this is where, again, you need to come in with the TA training, what supports need to be provided to make your average TA your ideal TA, right? So you've had this discussion and thought about what your average TA looks like and how they are related to your ideal TA. And so what supports need to be provided in order to make your average TA your ideal TA? Take another 3 minutes.
Yes, like Sweetwater or the Monday night. Yeah, I was.
Maybe just get so 3. This would be like what do we say? 36. So we get like a 12 pack of like 3 different local.
But we also want to get the type that Oh, we get a variety. That's true. Okay.
So we don't have that test now here. We don't teach now.
I don't really want to.
Here for them to address the part rather than being the part. Actually having real feedback. We're going to have a ton of these later. Yeah, we can bring it over. We're desperate. That's the thing.
Well, truly, the only thing that would really need, because everyone is doing that, is the red one, the white one, and the yellow one. Some people are thinking about it, the beer will stand.
That's right.
Okay. So thank you very much for playing along with this exercise. I'm hoping that what this exercise and what this activity I'm hoping what this activity brought to the surface is some of the things that need to be worked on, either the TAs that are here, something personal within yourself to be some sort of model or ideal TA, but also to, again, look at this TA training program and this professional development for TAs that we are here to start to develop or to start to enhance, right? And so these supports, this last question, are really the things that would work into your TA action plan. How can we actually start to professionally develop our TAs to become more and more ideal, or are the ideal TA for the curriculum that we're trying to teach? Right, and so you might question why identity. And so there are a lot of things that influence a student's identity or a person's identity, and they're all, well, they're not all listed in this funnel, but these are some of the things that I deal with in my research. So there's been a lot of research done about what affects a student's identity or what affects a person's identity. And so we know that at least in science, the student's socioeconomic background, presence of a role model, their interest in the subject, as well as their gender, sex, or gender expression all influence whether they feel aligned with a particular identity or not. And so, you know, you've heard people say, if you tell them you're a chemistry or a physics person, people are like, oh, I just never understood chemistry, or the one I hear most often, I'm not a math person, right? And so this identity as something, a type of person or not, is influenced by a whole host of things, right? We teach whole people, and we are all whole people, and so there's a lot of influences that are going on. There's also this bottom half of this funnel here that race or ethnicity does play a role. And then there's also this notion of where do you attribute your success or failure. One of my research group members is looking at to what do students attribute their success or failure. There's research to suggest that sometimes when a student fails, they may just say, oh, it's because I'm X, or oh, it's because I'm Y. And if they succeed, they say the same thing, but you can see how one of those could be more beneficial than the others. And that's not to say that this is a one-way direction. Some of these have a reciprocal relationship, right? So they affect how a student identifies, but how a student or how a person identifies could also affect their attribution or success or failure, especially with these bottom three here. The attribution, oh, that does not work. The attribution of success or failure, the stereotype, threat, and the sense of community. And so those are more of a reciprocal relationship with identity. And the little reference down there, there's a lot of references that go into this one slide. And so if you're particularly interested in the research on any one of these bubbles, let me know. I've got lots of resources for you. Okay? And so there's all of this stuff and more that are going on within our students and within our graduate TAs. And so they may not feel like they're ready to teach. They may not be a teaching person. Okay? And so if they've never taught before, this may very well be the first time they've ever set foot in front of a classroom. And that's terrifying. I still get nervous every time the first day of school that I get in front of my class of 300 students. I still get nervous, right? And so really what this goes down to is the GTA's identity, or some people in the chem ed field have called it self-image. And so the study a few years ago in 2013 by Sandy Urenia made three propositions about a GTA's identity or self-image. The first was that the GTA's teaching performance was associated with the way that they see themselves as instructors, and they defined that as their GTA self-image, and I'm extending that a little bit to their GTA identity. Okay? And so it's all about how they see themselves, right? It's their self-image or self-identity. The second proposition, it said that in the absence of any other factor, the GTAs will base their construction of their GTA identity or self-image based on their perception and interpretation of prior experiences, right? We all know this. People teach how they were taught. And so in the absence of everything else, without training, this is what they're going to go back to. And so if there is no structure in place to move the students or move the TAs along professionally, they're going to resort to what they know and what they're comfortable with. And the last proposition that they made is that training and staff meetings do actually influence the construction of their identity and self-image. And so the research does say that, yes, it's, in the absence of training, it's kind of ingrained, but through meetings and through kind of this professional development process, it is possible to change a GTA's identity or self-image to make them feel more like a GTA or feel more like a teaching person or feel like more like a teacher. Okay, so it is promising. It's not all bad news, right? And so the question becomes, and the reason we're all here today, is how can we actually support the development of a healthy GTA identity? And healthy can take a number of terms, and it's really based on what your ideal TA is. While we would love a TA that's just a workhorse, we know that that's not real, and that's not reality. And so it has to be healthy, right? And so they come in as an entering graduate student, the first time they may have ever been asked to teach, and somehow we expect them to then become a graduate teaching assistant, like in some of the groups here, with or without training. And so the question becomes, what's in this middle? How can we mitigate this, right? And so what the research tells us is that the most important factor affecting learning in the laboratory for students is the graduate TA. That's the most important factor. It's not what class it is, it's not the instructor of the course, it's the GTA that's actually facilitating their day-to-day work, right? And this makes sense. Often at many universities, there's an instructor of the course, and then there's lots of TAs that do the actual teaching. And they're the ones that interface with the students on a weekly basis. Okay? And so we really need to start thinking about who is our entering GTA. When they arrive on day one of orientation, who are they when they enter? And the reason I had you do that first activity was to understand better who is the practicing TA, or who do you want your practicing TA to be? And then in the middle, when do we do this training? When do we move them? How do we move them? And why? Right? And so that's the part that we're going to focus on next, and it's our next activity. And so what I would like you to do for 5 minutes, and you've already done this a little bit, and so think about who is your entering TA. Think about who your entering TA is on the first day. It could be descriptors, they might be international, they might be, it could be something about age, it could be percentages of male and female. So just identify who your entering GTAs are. Take 5 minutes and do so. In teams.
Bachelor's.
There's a what?
A big thing of fruit and a small thing of fruit. I guess we should find out from Emily if she knows why. So we can
How many are internationals?
And if you need space to write, you can flip the worksheet over. There's these prompts on the back of the worksheet that I had you draw your TA on.
How similar is self-image to self-concept? Are they different theoretically?
They're all intertwined, and it really just depends on the word that that you decide to use. Self-concept does come a little bit out of a little bit more out of the psychology literature, and I'd have to go back. It's been a while since I read the Sandy Urania paper, but I don't know if they do a really good job of differentiating self-image to self-concept, and I will say that I didn't really differentiate self-image and identity. I think those two words are going to be really hard to parse out, and so that's why I was like, okay, I'm okay doing this. I don't think anybody's going to say how you see yourself in your self-image is different than the identity you might take up. That'd be a
That's a tough one to tell.
yeah.
Thank you.
I know we have access to
Oh, there we go. It does work.
Yeah, well, the coffee break's coming up. People were definitely.
Some people did not eat breakfast at the hotel in being like, oh, the food at the workshop was better than the food at the hotel, so I'm going to wait. And then there was no breakfast here this morning.
I was worried about that because we gave it yesterday since people were just driving.
All right, I'm going to give you your 1 minute warning for the entering GTA. 1 minute warning.
an hour.
Okay.
Because your research seems relevant to my potential thesis topic. So
Perfect. I'll give you my card with my email and phone number and contact information, and just send me whatever you need. Yes.
So is this research you do in the chemistry department? So how does that work exactly?
So I have a joint appointment in our chemistry department as well as our STEM Transformation Institute. And so the STEM Transformation Institute just houses all of our discipline-based education research faculty. And so there's myself and one other chem ed person. We have 2 bioed people, 3 physics ed people, and there's just a whole cadre of us. But this is my tenure track research. And so it's just, my tenure home will be in chemistry. I just do research that looks a little different from everybody else.
Give your lecture a little bit of time since people are...
Okay, perfect.
It looks more like you're studying people in chemistry.
Yes. Yeah, so my research generally is looking at how students learn and interact with the subject of chemistry. My particular research, this is one vein, so looking at students' identity as a chemistry person or not, and what factors mitigate that identity. So a lot of it has to do, from what we've seen in our research, has to do with interest and understanding of the discipline. And so if students aren't interested and don't think they can do it, they're likely to not identify as a chemistry person. But if they do say that it's because they're interested and they understand it. And so it's really telling for us what is actually kind of making that chemistry identity. We've also done some work to look at the difference in a non-science majors course between whether they feel like a science person and a chemistry person, and they do. They respond differently on a survey for those items. We ask them the same thing, but first asking them about their chemistry identity and then asking about their science identity, and they do report them differently.
Okay, and all the methodology, because it's a very different methodology than what you must have learned. Or did you do your PhD also in something
Yes,
related?
so my PhD it's a PhD in chemistry, but my dissertation research was all chemistry education research.
Okay.
Okay, so I know some of you are up getting food, so we're going to meander to the next part. So now that we've identified our entering GTA, and right, we've had some practice with this by looking at, describing ourselves, but the next part that I want you to focus on is who is the practicing GTA, or who do you want the practicing GTA to be? And so this could be very similar to your ideal TA, but it does not necessarily have to be. I'm hoping that they would have some traits in similarity with your ideal TA, but it is not necessary. So take another 5 minutes and think about who is going to be the practicing GTA. And you can probably guess where it's going to go after that.
I don't want to break my tea with the experience of teaching. Oh, sorry.
I think it's definitely a stretch to ask them trying to study how to
You don't know what
what kind of
Yeah, but I think over time, this one of the class.
I mean, that's like my big thing, like where
What do you think of the new identity twist?
So that's interesting.
I'm trying to figure out what's the difference between self-image and identity.
I don't have an answer for that.
We should, because San Diego's, you're saying, is emphasizing more of the self-image, and your research is more on identity. So,
And I don't know if we can separate those two. I switched it to identity to fit more with the work that I've been doing in my research. But it is influenced a lot about the work that's been done on self-image.
So one thing I'm wondering also, the thing there's literature on identity from this so-called invoking of self, or this sort of thing, that there's this result with like the voting, this voting paper, to vote or to be a voter, and how that, you know what I'm talking about, that research? So how does that play in here? What do you think about that? Because actually I think it's rather controversial.
Yeah.
It looks powerful, right? This notion that just having people articulate that they are versus just the action of doing had an impact on their sort of participation.
And I haven't done this, and nor have I seen anything that's been done with to flip that to teaching.
That's what I want. Yeah, because I'm curious to think is invoking of self in this context.
Well, and that's and nothing's been. I haven't found anything about, especially about teachers' self-identity.
Yeah.
So it's part of one of the projects that's coming down the pike. But
it's very interesting because actually this ties into one is how one is, who one is. So that's sort of and actually you see. So rather than if you're trying to actually learn what you have to sort of see what situation they find themselves in,
right?
And how is it they go about, and that's how they go about. They're going about that way by who they are, right?
So there's a bunch of different ways you can. Convey your identity, and one is performative. So who do you display that you are? But then there's the other one that's introspective, that is just you, you think. And so there's not a really good way to get at that unless you ask them. But then that's still not accurate because they might not have words to be able to describe who they are.
Yeah. I don't know if they necessarily have. So that's the other thing is that they may not even be able to articulate, right? I think that's what you're saying. They can't articulate. The TAs don't know that there isn't, in some sense, an identity. There is a TTA identity, but as you mentioned, that absent anything else, that identity comes from
what they have,
right? And they're not necessarily reflecting on it. Just that they are in the situation, being who they are, how they are, who they are, but that who-ness comes from before, right? So this is the. So I think it's all really very interesting, and actually, there's a lot to be learned.
And I don't claim to have the answer.
And one thing is the issue, though, is also that this comes from this sort of developmental psychology, because this notion of change is hard, right? And people are. So there's this whole thing about communities to change.
Right, and once you develop an identity, it's relatively hard to change unless you have good reason to change your identity.
Right.
So a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm not a math person." Well, it's because math is hard for most people, and they just don't understand it. Maybe not understand its utility, or not be interested in it, or just not understand it flat out. And so it's just. It's very reticent to change, but we'll try.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last part of my workshop is a bit less structured than the beginning. And so hopefully now that you've identified who your entering GTAs are and who you want your practicing GTAs to be, you can fill in the middle part here, the when, the how, and the why. And really to answer those questions, that is training, experience, and mentoring. They need help to be able to get there. Now, if they're personality traits, some of those have come from their personality development. So there's not a ton that you can do to change someone's personality. But the other things you can actually start to build on or enhance through training, experience, and mentoring. And so this last part of the time here that you'll have with me this morning, what I want you to do is really focus on that action plan that you're developing, right? How can we, through training, experience, and mentoring, so what are those things that we're going to do to get our entering GTAs to or closer to our ideal GTA? And so some examples. When I was at Michigan State, I observed that they have their TAs make their own contract. And I put make their own in quotation marks because the TA contract never changes. But what the facilitator asked them to do and what the director asked them to do is to brainstorm as a group what a TA does and what a great TA looks like and what they're worried about. And so often, what a great TA looks like is the same from year to year to year. I've actually observed this for 3 years, and they all come up with the same things. And so every once in a while, they add something to the TA contract, but nothing ever comes off that TA contract. It stayed the same, and she said it stayed the same for about the past 6 or 7 years since she's been lab director. Okay, and so that's just one example of how you could get work to develop. You can have them sort of make their own TA contract. You could also, I've done this, you can have the TAs practice the labs as the students would do them and actually brainstorm student pitfalls and questions. So put them in that uncomfortable position of, you now get to do this lab. Figure it out, figure out what questions you have, and figure out where your students, be metacognitive, think about, okay, my students might also have problems with X, Y, and Z. Get them to do that thinking of beforehand. Now, these are not by any means prescriptive, but there's lots of examples. And so this is a more recent paper by one of my colleagues, Aisling Flaherty. She's at the University of Limerick now. And so she actually looked at the influence of psychological empowerment on the enhancement of the chemistry laboratory demonstrators, which is what they call TAs in the UK. And so she looked at their perceived teaching self-image and behaviors, right? And so what she found is that the program that was developed that focused on empowerment would enhance the sense of empowerment that they experienced, and as a means of enhancing their perceived teaching self-image and behaviors. So telling them that they actually have this within themselves and empowering them had a positive correlation with enhancing their perceived teaching self-image. They saw themselves more as a teacher by saying, and by empowering them that they can actually do this. They do have that within them. And she went on to further say that the level of psychological empowerment experienced by grad students lended considerable and positive contributions to their perceived self-image. So it's a direct relationship, right? As one goes up, the other goes up. It would be bad if it was the other way. As the increased psychological empowerment, the TA self-image went down. That would be bad. Right? So there is this notion, and this is published pretty recently. This was just back in 2017. And so there is work being done on how we can actually empower our TAs or our laboratory demonstrators to be effective teachers. Right? And so I have further examples on this, and this slide is also in your Google Drive, and so I'm not going to go through all these. But these are just some that I have experienced either as a TA myself or working as a postdoc at Michigan State or working as a faculty member at FIU. These are just a sum of the things that I've seen for GTA professional development programs. And so you can notice that there's a lot of different things going on here. And it really depends on what you're trying to get out of your TAs. Okay? And so what I want you to do for the last bit here, I've been told that I've had my time extended kind of into coffee break, but what I want you to do is now actually think about, maybe not fully, but how could you incorporate something about psychological empowerment, GTA self-image, or GTA identity into your action plan, and to keep those in mind. And so I will be around, and the facilitators will be around, and thank you for playing. I appreciate it. Yes. If I can find my mouse, there we go. And also, these are by no means prescriptive. These are just ideas that I've seen in my travels.
On that slide you mentioned biggest component of student learning in lab was the TA. I realized the reference was from the chemistry journal, so it's just based on that.
So the study was done in chemistry. I haven't come across, and I'll be honest, I haven't looked for any studies in physics. But my notion would be that being that it's a science field, even though we are different fields, I think you would find similar things. And I don't know if anybody studied TAs in physics lab.
I mean, some schools will learn independent.
Of course, yes.
For instance, the quantum class, I guess, the performance of the teacher.
Yeah.
Would it be one person or one group of people, or would it be different
Maybe that's not necessary. I mean, they're supposed to start doing these like.
I would like to see those references.
Okay. I have lots of them. Is there any particular bubble that you were interested in on that funnel?
So I do like a professional development course for elementary school teachers. I think,
Mm-hmm.
this is the product. I'm curious about either doing something with them, because there's been a few studies on elementary school teachers to view science, and I think it's got to be the same. There really hasn't been any focused on chemistry.
Right.
So,
And I think the problem at that young age is that they haven't started learning science as silos yet.
well, no, but that's I'm interested in the teachers, not the.
Of course, yeah.
What I found was like, because, so they broke it into, so the course I taught was matter as part of a sequence, and so it's ostensibly the chemistry course that just kind of adopted the GSS style.
Okay.
But I'm curious about, I asked them a few questions, and I'm curious about how they view chemists, because we're kind of like the same, like students, I'm not good at math, we get a lot of the like, oh, chemistry, I don't get it, right?
Yep.
Because we're like, can't see what we do, and you're right. But it's interesting because in order to make, what they're teaching the young students meaningful in a way, the progression from like, I show that parts can be put together and made into this, for us, it's like, oh, atoms.
Right.
But, it kind of shocked me working with the teachers, like, oh man, this is really hard.
Yeah, so, and I know there have been a lot of studies about teacher identity as a teacher.
Yeah.
But one of my future research projects is this notion of, how does a teacher of chemistry identify? Do they identify as chemistry teacher? Are they a teacher? Do they identify as a chemist? Or as a scientist, or as a biologist, which is a whole other host of, and trying to see how that affects the way they are in the classroom. I particularly focus on the scientific practices, and so that's my goal, is to look at their use and modeling of scientific practices in the classroom as a function of their identity as chemist, scientist, whatever. So I don't have any references on that, because there aren't any.
Yeah, but that's what I'm wondering, if I could if I could do a small study. It's just because I'm writing an IRB now terribly. It's painful.
Yeah, it is.
For the fall, but I was like, it would be easy to run, to run like, just have them start by going out what are the chemists and teachers actually because so many of them don't identify as scientists, let alone chemists, but no, I'd be curious if there's something I could give them.
Yeah, we'll chat. I'll give you my card and we can chat.
So I was going to ask you if we could chat about, because I know you said you're a postdoc. I'm curious what your traditional
Sure. We'll talk.
Yeah.
I think it might be easy to send that.
So like on the PhD, some of them focused Yeah, but you said they have some kind of protocol.
Justin, can
Yes.
you remind me that quote that you had on the board? The most important thing about learning in the lab
is the TA.
When was that? I wrote down.
It was it was Harrington. I believe it was 2007.
2007. Okay.
2003. Yeah, it's on my slides, which are up on the Google Drive.
Okay, so either 2003 or 2000.
But yeah, it's Harrington and Knockley.
Okay.
So I want to ask you what you think of this because I keep saying this to Jason. So in terms of prompting TAs to care more about their, so I would like to prompt it to believing in the need for teaching excellence. And so I think sometimes TAs are not aware that the impact is actually huge.
Right.
So that quote was perfect. I wonder if you have more in mind, like the.
And actually, that paper is really nice because it's an older study, and when it was kind of an early chem ed work, and so it is a little bit shorter, and I think it's a bit more accessible than some of the more recent research that we've started to ramp up the rigor and the denseness of our research. But I actually think it would be really accessible for TAs to read and be like, you're not just standing there like regurgitating information, like you do have value. And that may work for some students, but it might not work for all. But it can't hurt them.
No, exactly. Yeah. I just want to provide different motivation. Some might be kind of more individual, but some can actually think, well, I need
it's really trying. Yeah, and it's really trying to kind of like figure out, okay, how do I empower you to understand that you do matter, like you do make a difference, you are important, and that's the hard part. And it's gonna, like I said, it's gonna be different for every student and every GTA, but something is better than nothing. And so sometimes that will click with them.
This term of psychological empowerment. I don't know if I heard like a concrete definition of what that is. It sounds like a very dense phrase with a lot underneath it.
So if you go to the Flaherty paper, she does talk about what she means by psychological empowerment. I just didn't.
Okay. Are these already on here somewhere? Can you?
Yeah, so in the Google Drive.
Yeah, there's workshop sessions.
Workshop sessions, and then establishing a GTA identity, and there's my slides.
Just one here. Okay. Perfect.
And so you can see all my slides, and then I added the references to that last night, but there's the GTA self-image one.
Yes.
And then
So were these like hypotheses or were these?
No,
outputs?
those were born out of the data, and so it was a qualitative study, and he asked graduate TAs, and so that was actually what came out of the graduate TAs.
There was another question I had. These had a circle on top.
It was just the graphic, yeah. It was so all of those things, like the sum total of those plus way more, start to develop our identities in a particular subject, right? And so everybody has their own identity as it pertains to a very specific thing. So, I am a chemistry person. I identify as a chemistry person, but I don't love math as much. And so your identity can be different, but it can all be mitigated through these things. And so there's been a lot of work done in physics education research about what influences a student's physics identity. And we do know that physics identity can actually, it develops in high school. And it can also have an effect on what students choose as their career choice, as well as their success in their science classes. And so there's a lot that's been done, again, in physics identity, but much less so in chemistry. And so that's where I get to make my triumphant tenure pursuit. But the socioeconomic background, the race, the ethnicity, that all came out of physics, and we've seen the same thing in chemistry.
Okay. So those weren't. When I saw that, I thought there was some organizational structure.
Nope.
There was just.
They all influence identity, and for some of those, like the attribution of success or failure, their identity is somewhat of a reciprocal relationship with their attribution of success or failure. So, researcher that I mentioned that is studying black chemists, there's a number of things, a number of publications that kind of cite the notion that when black students fail, they tend to say, oh, it's because I'm black. You know, black people aren't just meant to be X.
Yeah.
And so it's just like, but it's, it has a lot of, of history behind it, but often, especially at FIU we have a high Latino population, and so specifically for Latino males, when they succeed, they attribute their success to themselves. It's because I worked hard. It's because I'm good at the subject. But if they fail, they chalk it up to being a Latino man. They said, we're just not cut out for this. I don't know why I even tried. We're just not in this space. And so it's really different and kind of shocking to look at where they attribute their success or failure. To just hear them say that it's from two different things and that it's not, success and failure come from the same place, but to what do they attribute that success or failure is something completely different.
So I'm curious, I need to read this, but I'm going to ask you about it anyway. So, psychological empowerment of what?
Of the TAs. So they.
But what are they being empowered to do or to think? Are they being empowered? Are they enhancing their teaching identity? Like, is that
so what they were trying to do is to empower them and to kind of realize that they have agency in the classroom. Like, yes, you have an instructor who's here, but you're the next level of power structure, right? You have some level of autonomy. You have some level of agency, and trying to get the TAs to realize that they're not just a peon, they're not just a worker bee, that they do have valuable input. And so those are a lot of the things that she tried to do and it's just kind of generally trying to empower them to understand that, and they can do it. They can succeed at it.
Okay, and then so by building that program, these TAs ended up having a better self-image of themselves as teachers.
Yes, at least as GTAs, but yes, as facilitators and as teachers.
Okay. Yeah, I just need to read this paper. There's lots of other questions.
It's long. I will warn you, but it's good.
Since you're over here, do we have any other questions?
Oh, I just have some. I really liked your drawing activity, and I thought actually I could use it in two different ways. I'm not sure. So first, I thought we want to have a session, orientation that helps TAs to bridge to what's their knowledge of the students, and so they would draw their ideal or maybe typical student, and then just talk about their misconceptions. But then we brought up the idea of the contra TA, so I think also drawing their ideal TA would more think about what they should aspire. I think I see both values. But we also thought that maybe they don't have enough experience to draw the ideal TA in some cases. Like for us was easier.
And so it depends on where the graduate TAs came from. So I went to a very small college, and so I never had a graduate TA. We didn't have a graduate program, and so the instructor was always the person that was in the lab. But others that went to bigger universities, they're like, oh, well, I had 8 TAs for all of my science courses in college, and so they have more experience, and those are usually the ones that would say, here's what the characteristics of a good TA were. But you can even just broaden that and say, it'd be like, if you haven't had a good TA, what makes a good teacher? Or a good instructor?
It's also very easy to say, I had a bunch of crappy TAs. I know what they did that I didn't like, and you can just reverse that line of thinking. Here's what would have been helpful for that TA to do.
And the idea of the contract is, instead of the drawing, you actually write down like what...
Yeah, so what she does is, they have them all in a classroom. There's like 40 of them, and it's for all graduate students, being that they're likely all going to be on TA at some point. And so really what they do is she has this brainstorm about what does a great TA look like? And so she just writes all of these things on the board. She writes it. No, it does. It comes from them. They shout out their answers, they all contribute, and she writes it on the board. And then at the end of the session, she takes a picture of it, and what she does, and she says, I'm going to take all these, and like, you came up with these. These are all going to be in your TA contract. This is our agreement. And they said, can you be these things? And they're all like, well, yeah, this doesn't seem hard. And so that's the way she gets them to buy in. Now, mind you, she's never changed that TA contract. It's just a document that's been saved on her computer. But what she knows what the document says, and so she asks questions. She's like, do they have to be on time to lab? And all the students are like, of course they have to be on time. And but you know,
yeah, we do this for classroom norms.
But it just makes them feel like, it gives them that sense of agency, right?
Of course, because it comes from them and it comes to each other.
Yeah, even if on the surface it came from them and they came up with all those ideas. You're welcome. Of course. Thank you.
Culture where teaching aspect doing one gets you one outcome and doing the other makes you a different outcome.
I think for the topic of this
Lots of good discussions are happening. Lots of good discussions are happening. How are things going with you guys? Good? Sorry, I didn't mean to get you while you were eating.
So we're really interested in this idea of like the transition between being a student and becoming a teacher, and like how that mentally takes a lot of time.
It does.
And how do we facilitate that process, but also allow the TAs to like implicitly say like, it's okay if this takes time, you know, like you're gonna need help.
And I think, and so I've been in like 4 institutions over my career, which isn't a lot, but in what I've seen, there are positives and negatives with how lab directors interact with their TAs.
Yeah.
I've seen very supportive things happen, and I've also seen some very demeaning things happen. But trying to, you know, instill this, it's okay to mess up. And so at Michigan State, when I was there as a postdoc, it was really easy to facilitate that notion because we used a project-based curriculum. And so the students were coming up with their own procedures. Their procedures may or may not, and are likely not going to work the first time. And so if the TA messed up, it's not a big deal, right? Because it's part of, almost designed into that particular curriculum that, you know, things aren't going to work. And they're all researchers, they're all in PhD labs, and so they're working on their bench research, and it's like, how often does your experiment work the first time? Perfectly.
Right.
And, you know, they all look at me and they're like, you're crazy. Like, no, never. And so it's just like, so you fail there. What's wrong with failing here? Like, we're here to support you. We're not here as, you know, to wag our fingers at you. Now, granted, if it's bad and you're like making egregious errors, then we might have to have a different conversation. But, you know, this is a professional development opportunity, and trying to just instill that in them so that they realize that it's not just, I'm expected to be at the top of my game, but they can be somewhere near the bottom as long as they're starting to make growth and making a conscious effort about it.
But is it, so without us having a project-based thing, right? Is it then just talking about, like, you're going to make mistakes, I make mistakes, let's all have this be like,
and it sounds very kumbaya, and very, but there's a lot to people, right? And so my research all focuses on the affective domain, and so that's students' attitudes and feelings towards the subject of chemistry. And what we found is that is, you know, there is the cognitive aspect, whether you know chemistry or not, but a lot of the success and failure is mitigated in their feelings about the subject and their attitudes towards the subject. And so, at least in research, that's been neglected for a long time. And so, at least with what I've found in TAs, you know, I usually sit down with them and say, you know, you can do this. I know it's scary to be in front of the classroom, but, you know, you've seen teachers, you have teachers probably from high school or from your college that you've liked and that you've gotten along with that you thought were effective. And so, we have them list those things so that they can start, understanding and hanging their hat on something that they've experienced and say, oh, I can try to emulate that. And it's really just trying to draw on their experiences. But I would say that if it's a more traditional cookbook laboratory, it's fine. It's not, but instilling that notion that yes, this is a procedure and yes, it should work. But we don't know if the stockroom mixed the stuff correctly, or if it's old, or if it says it's supposed to be 1 molar, but it's 0.1 molar in the stock jug. So there are things that happen, and we don't know that. I guess I don't know if I answered your question. It was a long-winded response, but
yeah, no,
Mhm.
I think that all makes sense with what we're thinking. These examples are really helping, and then
Mhm.
also we looked at that paper that the Liverpool or not
the Limerick one, the psychological empowerment one. That one, like I said, that paper is really dense. I will warn you now. But it's great, and I've actually worked with Ash. She was a postdoc at Michigan State this past year, and so I got to work more closely with her through another project. But she's awesome, and this level of work that she's been able to do is really, really great. And so that's why I included it. When I last did this workshop in 2017, the paper had come out literally a week before this workshop, and so that's why I was like, oh, good, and I read it on the plane on the way here. But no, I think that paper will provide a lot of different resources for you to try and work on that psychological empowerment, because that's a very broad definition, but it's really focused on this agency or this notion that it's okay to fail.
Yeah. And that's really hard to convey, especially I think at Northwestern we have students who come in and are very perfectionistic about, to make up a word, they are used to being the best and want to continue that in every aspect of their lives, and that's not possible. So
not everybody can be perfect.
Right. And that ends up contributing to a lot of the common problems that we see.
Cool.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Very welcome.
I think professionalizing it, we found is important. We try, and it's hard because they're just arriving, someone's accountable for actually doing their homework. But it's easy to communicate with that already does a lot. It's
good. Thank you.
We have a department chair come in at the beginning of this, or a social chair come in. Somebody that's going to leadership and be like, welcome, and this is
Thank you. Blue is my favorite color.
We're so excited that you're here. Yeah, our chair's been very good.
We do a round, they sit down.
You're going to grow as a scientist and as a communicator from this, and so, independent of the fact that you're doing all the
It's a goal.
Good morning. I know, I was doing the same thing. I was just like, somebody asked me a question, I had just put a bite of muffin in my mouth, and I'm like, please hold.
Is your session over, or are you working on
They're working, but they're also intermingling with coffee break, and so the next thing is Ken's
Okay, so
thing.
I can stop the video.
Yeah.
Okay.
First I thought maybe